Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Though an enemy encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. When my father and my mother have forsaken me, the Lord will take me in. Psalm 27. A psalm that must have resonated with people living in those early chapters in New Testament times. When they know it, but it doesn't feel like it. You know, Zephaniah is that little used passage in the Old Testament talking about that future day. We all know Isaiah 7:14. We know that one, we can quote it backwards and forwards, but that Zephaniah passage we talked about last week is that you should rejoice on that day when the Lord is in your midst, a mighty one to save, and you shall no longer fear evil. But we do. That's why when the angels showed up in the Gospel of Luke to the shepherds, the first words out of the angel's mouth, fear not. Even to Mary, when the first words were, greetings, you're highly favored, her response showed a sense of trepidation. So the angel says, don't be afraid. What was the first thing? The first thing mentioned in God's creation? Now, I know you want to say light, but remember, there is nothing that has been made without it being made by God. We believe everything is radically dependent on God. And before you get to verse 3 of Genesis 1, you've got an earth without form. You've got an earth without void. You've got the depths, and you've got darkness. When you're dealing with the worst situations in your life, and when you're looking forward and all you can see is grief and pain, bone-chilling pain, it is comforting to know that God's light-filled creation arose out of the darkness, shined brightest against the backdrop of the darkness. Darkness that God was able to use to bring about his glorious plan. I mentioned Genesis because in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1, Matthew begins by literally saying the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ. Now, I know that for most of you, your Bibles are going to say genealogy. The word here can mean origin, but literally it's the word Genesis. We don't have too much problem comparing Genesis and the story of Jesus. John makes it explicit. Remember John's prologue? In the beginning, the first 3 words of John are the same as the first 3 words of Genesis. In the beginning. But instead of in the beginning was creation, or in the beginning was light, he says in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And by the time you get to verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Genesis story being retold, not focused on us, but focused on Him, a creation by Him, from Him, and for Him. So Matthew says the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ. And you start to see some things that remind you of the book of Genesis. You don't get out of the first verse of Matthew without noticing the name Abraham. We meet Abraham in Genesis. And it's there where God calls to him and says, I want you to leave the land you know And I want you to go to a land you don't know. Can you imagine the fear, the trepidation, the uncertainty? And he moves. He moves with the only confidence one can have in a move like that, to believe that God is with him. We see the name Isaac. We see the name Jacob, fathers of the faith that we meet in Genesis. But just like in the story of Genesis, we see light and we see darkness. When we read names like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, David and Solomon, Uzziah and Josiah, we see heroes of the faith, men whose stories of valor and courage were bedtime stories filling the bedchambers of young Jewish boys and Jewish girls. These were the stories told in the light of day. But we see darkness too. There are stories that didn't make it into polite company, and certainly age-specific. There are stories in this genealogy that we probably still don't tell in our elementary Sunday school classes. I'm talking about the women. You know, it was a fairly unusual thing to list a woman's name in a genealogy. You use the genealogy not just to trace your ancestry, but to speak with pride. This is the story, the song of life that you would tell about what makes you so special and what makes Israel so great among the nations. And so those names are important. It's not without precedence. There are some examples. You have genealogies in Genesis, chapter 5, chapter 10, chapter 11, and you do have some women mentioned in chapter 11. You have some women mentioned in 1 Chronicles, but it's fairly unusual, and when they are mentioned, it's usually innocuous. But Matthew, in just 16 verses, mentions 5 women, and not the 5 you probably would have assumed. You won't find Deborah in this list. You don't find Esther. You do find Ruth, and we'll come back to that later. But instead, you find names associated with stories that bring to mind fear, uncertainty, worry, maybe even activities that feel a bit seedy. Something done in the dark corners that are supposed to stay in the dark corners. But Matthew brings it to light. And there's method in his madness, because Matthew is leading up to a story that's going to trump all of those stories. But I'd like you to look. I'd like you to open your Bibles, and I'd like you to look and see if you can find the 5 women mentioned in Matthew chapter 1. In the middle of the night, on January 27th, 1956, Martin Luther King got a call. "Listen, we're tired of you and your mess," the voice said. "If you ain't out of this town in 3 days, we're going to blow your brains out and blow up your house." He was 26 years old and scared to death. You see, it had just been 2 months since Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, and the Montgomery boycott had begun. And the leaders of the boycott began to call all the black ministers in the area to try to get support. And when they called Martin, Martin was very reluctant. 26 years old. He said, "I'll have to think about it. Why don't you call me back?" They didn't call back. But 2 days later, they picked his church, where he was the preacher, to be the place for the boycott meeting. So he felt like he had to go. And all the older ministers knew how dangerous this could be, so they conspired before he even got there. And within minutes, he was elected president of the boycott committee. He said later, "I didn't think about it much. If I had, I would have declined immediately." And now, Now he's living a life where it's begun the obscene phone calls, the hate mail, the threats against his wife and his infant daughter. And now on this night, the chilling call promising murder and arson, and he was scared to death. Paralyzed with fear, those are his own words. And he sat down in the kitchen and he poured himself a cup of coffee. And he thought to himself, how in the world can he get out of this boycott committee? And there in the darkness of the kitchen, he prayed. And Martin Luther King says that he heard a voice, a powerful voice, and it may have been the voice of the scriptures that he had memorized as a kid. Lo, I will be with you always, even unto the end of the world. King writes, he promised never to leave me. No, never to leave me alone. No, never alone. No, never alone. He promised to never leave me, never to leave me alone. So he stayed with it. 4 days later, he went to lead a boycott committee rally at the church, while his wife and his 2-month-old stayed at home. And when he finished his speech, somebody ran up to the podium to tell him, your house has just been bombed. When he got back to his neighborhood, he could see his house on fire, the front completely destroyed. He checked on his family. His family was okay, but he looked around. And he saw his neighborhood full of citizens who shared Martin's background and sympathized with his situation, armed with knives and bats and bottles and guns. And he saw a line of cops trying to keep order. And Martin Luther King displayed the courage and patience that can only come from believing that God is with you. He made his way to the smoldering embers left on his front porch, and he stood on the rubble of his firebombed house, and he signaled for the crowd to quiet down. He said, if you've come to do battle, remember that he who lives by the sword will die by the sword. Instead, standing in front of his bombed-out house, face to face with an angry mob ready to unleash their anger as soon as he gave the word, he looked at the crowd and he said, I want you to love your enemies. Be good to them. Love them and let them know that you love them. What we're doing is right. What we're doing is just. And God is with us. People who were there that night have shared their incredible testimony as to what they saw. Tears began streaming down faces. They dropped their knives, laid down their bats, and instead held hands and began to sing Amazing Grace. It was a turning point where a movement based in a righteous cause but uncertain about the way they would go about it chose to root itself in an ethic of love, forgiveness, and nonviolence. And Martin's wife said, quote, this could well have been the darkest night in Montgomery's history, but the Spirit of God was in our hearts. What could have been the darkest night in history turned into something bright, for the Spirit of God was hovering over their hearts. That brings me back to our new book of Genesis. I read through the genealogy that Matthew gives us as he begins his gospel, and I see fear. So much fear. I see worry. I see loneliness. And I see waiting. How could these stories possibly end up good? In verse 3, we are introduced to Tamar. Tamar is a Canaanite woman without a husband, an outsider with no support, pregnant with her father-in-law's baby, who's now called for her to be burned But then, by the mercies of God, the story takes a wonderful turn. She's not hurt. Instead, she's praised. And the child she gives birth to is a child of promise through whom one day comes the Christ, for God was with her. Verse 5 tells us about Rahab, a woman from Jericho without a husband, who is known in Jericho as a prostitute. But there were times and places then, like there are times and places now, where a single woman who wishes to provide for herself in a man's world has few choices. Who knows what would have ultimately been the fate of Rahab had it not been for the fortuitous moment when God sent spies into the land, needing a place to hide. And Rahab, the prostitute, becomes a woman of valor, getting her name listed in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11, and right next to the example of Abraham in James chapter 2. And the text says that Joshua and the spies rescued her and her mama and her brothers and all who belonged to her because God was with her. But here in Matthew, and only here in Matthew, do we learn the incredible fact that she gave birth to a son, a promised child, through whom came the Christ. We see Ruth, a Moabite woman, who also had a husband who had died. And Deuteronomy 23:3 says Moabites should stay out of the congregation of Israel up to the 10th generation. She leaves her homeland and she lands in a strange place with only her mother-in-law. Don't leave me alone, she says. Where you go, I will go. Your God will be my God. And he would be, for God was with her. Boaz gives her food. He gives her shelter. And then by marriage, he gives her a name and hope and a future and a child through whom came the Christ, for God was with her. In verse 6, her name isn't even mentioned. She's called the wife of Uriah, but you know who this is. Her name is Bathsheba, snatched from her home by a powerful king and taken to his bedchamber, all while her husband was fighting faithfully for the same king. We aren't told her side of the story, but I do know that there are places then, just as there are places now, where the emperor gets what he wants, and you have little choice. And now she's pregnant with the king's baby, while their faithful husband is away on the battle lines. Can you imagine the fear she must have felt? And she watches in horror as King David murders her husband and then tries to cover his tracks. And then he takes her and he adds her to his harem. She loses that sense of purity. She loses her reputation. She loses her husband. And to top it all off, she loses her child. Fear, uncertainty. But the story isn't over, for God was with her. Another child is born, a promised son, Solomon, and the Lord loved him, and through him came the Christ. Why do you think, in an age when usually only men were listed in genealogies, virtually only men were listed as righteous examples, Matthew would list 5 women? I say 5 because everything points to tragedy, and that's when God points to hope. When all you see is a husbandless woman bearing a child as a thing of fear and shame, God says, look again. For this has often been the red carpet that rolls out before my arrival. I work marvelous things in situations like these. Don't you find it interesting that some of these women were names that were left out of Jewish circles when discussing heroes of faith, and in their place, they tell tales of faithful, heroic Abraham. But they probably would leave out the fact that he lied about Sarah, his wife, turns her over into the hands of another, and tries to have a promised heir with his concubine rather than waiting on and following the instructions of the Lord. They told faithful and heroic tales about Jacob, who only secured his place in the lineage leading to Jesus through lies and deceit. And what about Rehoboam's greed or David's murder? Have you ever read the rap sheet on Ahaziah, who's mentioned there? This list that Matthew gives us is anything but a list of heroes. Maybe we're supposed to see the women fighting against all odds to offer up some light of day to counter the darkness that surrounded them. And yet, God somehow worked through all of them. God was willing to be with every one of them. Good news, because it means God can and will be with me and you. A genealogy full of adulterers and prostitutes, heroes and Gentiles, everyday people. So let me say a word to the women and men in the audience today. To every reader of Matthew's story, when you find yourself in what seems like a hopeless situation, see what others don't see. If you focus on the problem, you never see the solution. Look behind the veil of the curtain and know that God is with you. He's there in the darkness because that's where God begins his work, when he brings about new creation and new light. The visit to the shepherds was at night. His star in the east shone at night, and the little baby Jesus was there in the darkness of the womb. God is present with you in the darkness. That's not when he's absent. That's when he shows up. Isn't that what all the verses that are on the tip of our tongues remind us? Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For God is with me. When you pass through the waters, Isaiah says in Isaiah 43, I'll be with you. And through the rivers, they won't overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you won't be burned. Fear not, says the Lord. I have redeemed you. I've called you by name. You're mine. You're precious in my eyes. Honored. You're full of my love. Fear not, for I am with you. My God is with you. If you've been struggling with infertility like Hannah, and you've been crying out, wondering why he won't give you the one thing you've been asking for, can I remind you, God is with you. If you find yourself abused and mistreated by people in your life, like so many of the women we've talked about, and you wonder if God cares at all about what you're going through, if he sees it, if he can somehow take your story and turn it into something beautiful, can I remind you, God is with you. If you're a simple man working a simple job like Joseph, and you find something has happened now in your life that's going to change the course of your life, and you don't know what tomorrow holds, you don't know what you're going to do, may I remind you, my God is with you. And if, like Mary, you find yourself in an unexpected situation, the language of divorce is on the table. You don't know who to confide in. You don't know who to talk to. You wonder what your story is going to be. Can I remind you, my God is with you. He is ever present. Because the same Jesus who's called Emmanuel in chapter 1 of Matthew says to us in the last verse of the book, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. He promises. Will you accept his promise? We want you to know that Jesus Christ stands here with his arms open wide, wanting you to fall into them. We'll take you just as you are, but Christ never leaves you that way. We'll take you just as you are. We'll take your good confession that Jesus is Lord, and we'll bury the old person in baptism. We'll leave the old person behind, but the person who rises to walk in a new life is a person filled with the Spirit of God. And Jesus says, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. Your story of fears can be turned into a story of joy, and your crying in the night can be turned into a sound of singing and jubilation when you know that my God has got you and he won't let go.